What is up, APUSH? It's Mr. Hill coming at you Monday night, and we're about to do APUSH review, period two. Once again, 1607 to 1754. What is going on in this time period? We should know it. This is our colonization era, and we know that because 1607, of course, is the formation of Jamestown, and 1754 is the start of the French and Indian War. Our key themes going on. We have differences in the goals, cultures, and environment of our colonists led to very diverse colonies. We need to be able to compare and contrast the different colonies of the Massachusetts area, New England's, coming down into the middle colonies, coming down to the Chesapeake, finally coming down to the lower South colonies. We have triangular trade and mercantilism going on, yet we have salutary neglect. And then finally, the Great Awakening. We will talk about Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. Again, we've got that key contextual vocabulary. What's going on in this time period? It's all about mercantilism. It's all about those navigation acts. So in part one, we talked about the New England colonies. We talked about the Massachusetts Bay Colony and Plymouth. We talked about Rhode Island being that kind of haven for people that were expelled from the New England colonies, and the other one being Connecticut up there. We also talked about the Chesapeake colonies with the headright system and tobacco having much more. Initially founded as a quick profit with the Virginia Company with Jamestown. And so we had this way high male population in the Chesapeake, which caused women to have more rights in the Chesapeake because there were so many more men and it was so much more dangerous. So now we're going to talk about the colonies that are in the middle of those two places. And of course, they're rightly named the middle colonies, but they're actually rightly named for several reasons. Not only are they the middle colonies as far as their geographic location, but they're also middle in a couple of other ways. The first is that obviously they're going to have bigger farms than the rocky soil of New England, but they have smaller farms than the more monopolistic Chesapeake region. And because of this, the middle colonies are in the middle as far as size of farms. Yes, you did have some indentured servants coming over and working in the middle colonies, but you also had just hired laborers and family work. You also didn't have a devotion just to one particular type of crop as you did down at the Chesapeake. However, most of our middle colony farmers are going to specialize in oats or grains, especially wheats. But of course, you also have some lumbering and shipbuilding. As well as manufacturing. And of course, you also had some very big harbors in the big cities of New York and Philadelphia. I just realized I wasn't in presentation mode, embarrassing. Okay. New York is kind of the unusual one because it's the one colony that's initially established by Henry Hudson, who of course is Dutch. The Dutch are going to claim the New York region. Henry Hudson is going to travel up the Hudson River and find Manhattan, which then they are going to trade for the entire island of Manhattan with the Native Americans for worthless trinkets. And now the Dutch have claimed New York. And this is kind of the golden era of Dutch history. The Dutch have just broken away from the Spanish in 1588, and they have now come out and established a trading post empire around the world. In fact, they're gaining lots of wealth from the Dutch East India Company over there in Indonesia, Malaysia area. And so now with the Dutch, with all of this wealth and prosperity, look to do the same thing in the New World. They established the Dutch West India Company. They established New Amsterdam, which is a trading post similar to Quebec that the French have up in Canada, where they're largely trading for furs and doing a little bit of tobacco farming themselves. However, back in England, Charles II promises this land to his brother, the Duke of York. And in fact, the English always viewed the Dutch as outsiders when they claimed New York, because by this time, the English have settlements on both sides. They have settlements, obviously, up in the north with the New England colonies, and then further south with the Chesapeake. And because of this, the English are going to use military action to push out the Dutch. An English squadron arrives on the horizon, and they push all of the Dutch out of New York. And in 1664, New York is established, and New Amsterdam becomes New York City, where it still has many different Dutch influences. The different boroughs of New York, for instance, are still Dutch names, with like Harlem, for instance, being one of those places. Brooklyn being another. And Pennsylvania, the other very important middle colony when it comes to what we have to remember and know. We actually start with a Quaker by the name of William Penn. William Penn had a rough upbringing. He was from a very rich family, a very prominent English family, and he became a Quaker at a young age, and his father beat him for it, did not want him to become a Quaker. Quakers, as other religions, were persecuted in England. But his father passed away, and actually the crown had owed a lot of debt to his father, and so in return they give him this huge woodland in the New World that they call Pennsylvania, which is Penn's Woodlands. And because of this, William Penn is now our proprietor, our starter of Pennsylvania. And he is going to look to establish a Quaker haven, a place in which Quakers can come in and not be persecuted against. And so he does so, and that makes Pennsylvania very much like Rhode Island to be a very, very tolerant place in the world, and certainly one of the most tolerant places in the 13 colonies, because the Quakers, as I always equate to the hippies of the 17th century. They're very much nonviolent. They believe in the equality of all men and women, and this actually also pertains to Native Americans, who William Penn and the Quakers were very kind to. They paid them for their land, even employed them as babysitters. Also, their belief is that religious authority was found within each person's soul, not in the Bible, not in a clergyman, etc. Because of this, the Quakers didn't have a tax-supported church, so everyone kind of has their own relationship with God. And because of this, many Quakers are going to flock to Pennsylvania. They leave England. Penn is also going to provide a representative government and a written constitution called the Charter of Liberties that, kind of similar to in Maryland with the Act of Toleration, guaranteeing freedom of worship. Of course, the big difference, the Charter of Liberties is extreme and complete freedom of worship, unlike the Act of Toleration in Maryland, which, of course, killed atheists and Jews. We also have the West Indies, and we always talk about there being 4 regions to discuss when it comes to the colonies, the English colonies in North America. But in fact, there really are 5 regions, because we have to include the Caribbean in this discussion, because quite frankly, the Caribbean was by far the most profitable of colonies that existed for the British at this stage because of all the sugar production. The Spanish, of course, initially colonized all of the Caribbean and Central America and most of South America. But the Spanish at this stage are starting to lose some of their great empire, largely because in 1588, 2 major things happened to the Spanish. The first is that King Philip tries to invade England, and with the famous Spanish Armada, and the Spanish Armada is defeated by the British in a valiant defense of their country, and a large storm that occurred in the English Channel to this day is called the Protestant Wind, defeating the Spanish oncoming Armada. But secondly, that happened in 1588 is the Dutch broke away from the Spanish, and so the Spanish are having to deal with lots of problems at home, and they start to lose track of their island nations in the Caribbean. And because of this, the English steal from them 2 very profitable island nations, Jamaica and Barbados. And Jamaica and Barbados become very profitable sugar colonies that are worked on largely by West African slaves. We talk about slavery starting to start slow in the North American colonies, in the British North American colonies, because we don't really start to see a high influx of slaves into North America until after 1676 with Bacon's Rebellion. But that's not true of the Caribbean. The Caribbean, we saw about 250,000 slaves come over into the Caribbean between 1650 and 1700, the ratio of slaves to white colonists in the Caribbean is about 4-1 slaves to colonists. So we see there is a harsh slave culture that already exists on the doorstep of our 13 colonies in the mainland. And because there's such this huge discrepancy of slaves to freedmen in the Caribbean, there has to be these strict laws that are going to keep the slaves from rebelling against the colonists. And that's where we're going to see the Barbados Slave Code of 1661, which really dehumanizes West African peoples, denies them all rights. They're not a citizen. They're, in fact, property, and the master has the right to punish them. And this form of slavery, chattel slavery, is what is going to be embraced by the southern colonies, who are heavily tied to these sugar economies in the Caribbean. And on that note, we talk about the southern colonies, the plantation economies, they're called. Now, first of all, Virginia, Maryland, um, are Chesapeake colonies, but once again, they are considered southern colonies. But when we talk about the plantation economies, we're really talking especially about South Carolina and Georgia. Although you could argue that Virginia has some large plantations, of course, with the first families of Virginia. But let's talk about the population in the Carolinas and Georgia. While the mass majority of people are small farmers, just like really the rest of the 13 colonies, there are the top 1% of former nobles from England. When you think about how the Carolinas were formed. The Carolinas were formed by King Charles II, having just been given the throne by Parliament. He's going to reward his political friends, his political allies, by giving them huge amounts of land in the New World. And so the political allies are going to be English nobles that have a tremendous amount of wealth, and they're very used to the rigid feudal structure of England. And so when they come over to the New World, they're going to try to emulate England in many ways. They're going to look at themselves as lords that inherit their title and power, and they're going to look to buy as much possible land as possible. Right from the start, that we have the most aristocratic, conservative peoples in South Carolina. They're going to have these huge plantations that are going to be heavily tied to England and to anyone that's going to buy their mass production of goods. When we talk about a mass production of goods, at first it's rice and indigo. And speaking particularly of rice, if you're producing all of this rice, for one, rice is produced on hot, swampy plantations. And right away, the South Carolinians are going to look to Western Africa as people to work on these rice plantations because they're malarial. They're infested with malaria, and they have these mosquitoes. And West African peoples have a higher tolerance, a relative immunity to malaria that allows them to work far more effectively in these environments. And in addition to that, because of the geography of South Carolina, particularly have these rivers and you have this huge port at Charleston, South Carolina becomes the biggest example of a pure export economy that is looking to simply produce large amounts of foodstuffs and be able to sell them to England and to the West Indies. We have this high connection to the West Indies because there's so many mouths to feed. There's so many slaves there. And thus South Carolina becomes the first state that looks to adopt the slave codes, such as the one from Barbados, the Barbados Slave Code of 1661. When you talk about all of these southern colonies, with the exception of Maryland, there is a tax-supported Church of England. When we talk about the Church of England, this is the biggest connection to the old world. And of course, the head of the Church of England is in fact the King of England. And therefore, the Church of England really was, as your book says, a prop for kingly authority, meaning every time you go to church and every time you pay taxes to the church, you're in a sense, honoring the king and honoring that, in fact, the king is above you in all ways of life. Talking about the two different Carolinas, as I mentioned, South Carolina is far more aristocratic. Many settlers, rich English settlers coming from Barbados, bringing their slaves with them and bringing the slave system with them, chattel slavery, and the slave codes. We have these very large plantation existing in South Carolina, 2,000 acres, bigger than any other place in the 13 colonies. They also have by far the best port, Charleston. North Carolina does not have anywhere same to the same size or deep water port that Charleston is. Um, we also see that because land ownership is such a big requirement for politics and being able to vote, that the aristocrat families are going to dominate politics just as the first families of Virginia dominate politics in Virginia. Now, North Carolina is entirely different. Now, first of all, the Carolinas used to be one colony, but there was some irreconcilable differences between North Carolina and South Carolina that caused them to split in 1712. And the biggest being is just the way of life, that North Carolinians largely were just small farmers that couldn't find land in Virginia. And so they came down into North Carolina and they started working on the land with no actual title to the land or claim to the land. Therefore, they were legally squatters. They didn't have, an actual land title. But because there was no one to enforce the laws out on the frontier, they lived just as small farmers farming for themselves, sometimes as modest tobacco farmers. Obviously, because they were such small farmers, they had little need for slaves and frankly couldn't afford slaves. Slaves are very expensive in this time period. Now, because they were mostly small farmers, they tended to resent the aristocratic lives of the South Carolinians. And North Carolina actually tended to be far more democratic and had a bigger resentment for the planter aristocracy that existed in South Carolina. Georgia, the last and final of our 13 colonies, was also the last one to come in chronologically. But when we talk about it, it really is most similar to South Carolina as far as the people that came in and farmed there. I will say that originally it was given to nobles of England in order to protect the Carolinas from Spanish Florida. We have the Spanish in Florida, and South Carolina was so important to the economy of England that Georgia was put as a buffer colony, a protection colony to protect South Carolina. But it was actually founded for very good reasons. The founder was a man by the name of James Oglethorpe, which founded the colony to help people in debt, be a debtor prison haven. He actually resisted slavery initially. Unfortunately, after he passed away, the very rich soil in Georgia became too alluring to slave owning whites, and they eventually came in and populated Georgia, and it became a heavily slave state with lots of plantation agriculture. In a comparison of all of our colonies' women's rights, it was starting with the top, starting with New England, we saw just in general a much higher life expectancy for all people. But because of the concept of original sin, because of the quote unquote betrayal of Eve in the Garden of Eden, we see that women are seen as morally weaker than men. And because of this, they were very restricted in their active life. They couldn't vote. They couldn't really even leave the household without a male companion with them. On an average of 10 pregnancies, yikes, which meant, of course, that a woman was really childbearing and child raising was really a full-time job in New England. However, there were laws existing to protect women from the abuse from their husbands, but much better rights as we come into a little bit south and we get into the southern colonies and the Chesapeake. Because the life expectancy was so much shorter and because there was so many more men, there needed to be laws that protected women. Married women had a title to their property, could inherit their husbands' estates. And then the middle colonies, depending on the state, typically was somewhere in the middle. Women's rights in New York weren't very good because they had more of an aristocratic kind of conservative atmosphere. But if you went to Pennsylvania, women's rights were excellent because of all the Quakers. Looking at the economies of these different regions, some of the things to point out when you look up at, for instance, the New England colonies here, you see fishing, you see whaling, you see lumbering. They had to be very creative with their economies with the rocky soil and the long winters. Coming down to the middle colonies here, and it's really all about cattle and grain, as you can see. When you come down into the Chesapeake, you can see this dark green representing tobacco. And then, of course, down into South Carolina and Georgia, you see the rice and indigo, the plantation colonies of South Carolina and Georgia. Chronologically, looking at what year each was founded and who it was founded by. But we move on to Bacon's Rebellion. Nathaniel Bacon is a small farmer, a former indentured servant, who is quite frustrated by the fact that there's not enough available land for indentured servants to buy. That indentured servants come over to the New World because they believe there will be an opportunity for them after they finish their 5 to 7 years of indentureship, that they believe that they should have a opportunity to buy land and to make an honest living of themselves. But especially in Virginia, all of the available land is purchased by the first families of Virginia, by the Washingtons, by the Lees. And so the only available land is further west. But the problem is the land further west, there's no protection from the Indians. And that's really what Nathaniel Bacon is so frustrated about, is that there are continuous raids by the Indians on the frontier, and the Virginia governor, William Berkeley, is not doing enough about it. And because of this, he is going to rabble up a army of impoverished indentured servants and poor farmers. They're going to lead a rebellion on Jamestown, where, of course, the Virginia governor, William Berkeley, lives. They're going to burn most of Jamestown to the ground, and they're going to be in an open rebellion for about a year until Nathaniel Bacon dies of dysentery and everything kind of settles down. But this is a scary event in the eyes of the landowners and the eyes of the aristocracy. And they realize that this indentured servitude system creates a problem, that the people coming over in this system are going to eventually be free, and they're going to eventually want land and wealth and opportunity. And so the two big things that this shows, the first one, of course, is that there are big differences between the poor in these colonies and the wealthy. And then the other one is that they're now large plantation owners are going to look for a more stable labor force that is totally under their control and will not become free at any point. And that, of course, is what's going to turn the mainland North American colonies, especially those in the South, to look to West Africa, to look to the Atlantic slave trade. And sure enough, by the mid-1700s, 40% of the Chesapeake population were slaves. And one by one, states start adopting slave codes and laws that are going to keep West Africans in slavery. In 1750, slaves were half of Virginia's population and 2/3 of South Carolina's population. And that is especially telling because South Carolina, most people there were not slave owners. So when you look at that 2/3 of South Carolina's population were enslaved, what that means is the people that had slaves had a lot of slaves. And that, of course, makes sense given the aristocracy in South Carolina. And the last concept we talk about is the Great Awakening. And the big picture on this, guys, is that we are a country that was founded by a incredible amount of very devoted colonists, very, very religious colonists that truly believed very strongly in their religion. They believed in reaching heaven through whatever way in which their religion dictated. And they believed that hell was a very real thing. And they were scared of hell and they were worried about hell, especially in New England, where the Calvinist doctrines were raging. And people truly believed that they were going to burn in hell unless they were visible saints. But as time went on, as generations went on, there was less of a fear of hell, and there was, in general, less religion, less fervor in religion. But this changes in the 1730s and 40s. There is a colony-wide dramatic religious revival, and it's going to especially occur because we have these new preachers from overseas that are going to preach their ideas of having a relationship with God. And this is going to sweep into the preachers in the Americas. And it is going to cause this massive feeling of people becoming more religious. We have two great awakening reverends. The first is Jonathan Edwards from Massachusetts, who gives this famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, where he says that hell is lined with the skulls of unbaptized people, and so he tries to scare you into becoming more religious. These reality-shattering sermons of God's power, and then you have George Whitefield from England, who has this legendary booming voice. It was said that Benjamin Franklin, upon hearing him speak, emptied out his pockets. And Benjamin Franklin, very skeptical of religion in general, but he did believe in the religious powers of George Whitefield from England. Interesting about Whitefield and many of these Great Awakening reverends, that they often taught that people could understand the Gospels without depending on ministers to lead them. Many of these preached that it was important to start reading the Bible again, to start going back and becoming more religious and revisiting, the Ten Commandments and all these things. But interestingly enough, it was often perceived by these new lights, these people that are converting to religion, that they could do this in their own way, in whichever way that they felt that they could get closer to God. And so what this Great Awakening is really going to do is it's going to start to challenge the established churches in the 13 colonies, such as the Church of England, such as the Congregational Church up in Massachusetts, in New England. And it's going to create new churches because we have all these new lights that are going to worship in their own ways. And, when we look at the impacts of these things, old ministers lost some of their former authority because we have people studying the Bible in their own homes. And then we have new churches that are being created, the Methodist Church, the Baptist Church. Many are going to call in question that these tax-supported churches, like the Congregational Church, like the Church of England, they have a monopoly on worship in the Americas, and they're going to say this shouldn't be the case. There shouldn't be tax-supported churches. That there should be people should be able to belong to whatever church they want to. And because we start to see the questioning of churches, this is also going to have a political influence as well. For one, this has this democratizing effect in the colonies because many people throughout the colonies are going to feel as though this is the first time that the lines of the different colonies are starting to blur, and that regardless of your social class, your national origin, or what colony you're in, everybody has felt this religious movement. So it's a very Americanizing movement. But the other thing is that people are going to say, well, if we are starting to challenge these tax-supported churches, can we also challenge the other thing that controls the Americans' lives, which is the crown? And this is one of our long-term causes of the revolution, of course. Okay. Our DBQ outlines assignment for the tonight and for tomorrow is the 1993 AP test DBQ. Believe it or not, the 1993 AP test had 11 documents. That's insane. You guys, of course, are only doing a 5-document DBQ. The prompt: although New England and Chesapeake region were both settled largely by people of English origin, by 1700 the regions had evolved into 2 distinct societies. Why did this difference in development occur? We have 5 documents, and I will tell you, the documents are a little bit more difficult than Unit 1. I've kind of stepped up the difficulty for you guys, but you guys can handle it. You guys are pros. I know you can do it. So that is it for me today. I hope you guys found that to be mostly review, and I will talk to you guys in a Zoom meeting very soon. Good luck, and talk to you soon. Stay safe.